The pipeline drilled through his best field. One old document made them restore every acre. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March of 1987. Eldon Marsh was 61 years old, standing at the end of his driveway in Saline County, Arkansas, when the rural mail carrier handed it to him without slowing down. The envelope had a corporate logo in the upper left corner. Mid-South Energy Transmission. He'd never heard of them. He set it on the kitchen table and went back out to finish checking fence line on the East 40. He didn't open it until supper. The letter said they were coming, not asking. Coming, Mid-South Energy had an easement right-of-way across the southeast corner of his property, granted in 1961. They intended to exercise it. Construction would begin in approximately 90 days, a 24-inch natural gas transmission pipeline. They planned to bore through the low field along the creek bottom, the 18 acres Eldon had spent 3 summers terracing and improving. They planned to cut a 50-foot wide corridor through it. They planned to disturb the topsoil, compact the subsoil, and then, and this is what they said in their letter, in the language their lawyers had drafted, restore the affected area to pre-construction condition. Eldon read the letter twice, folded it, put it back in the envelope, went to bed. The low field had been his best production ground for 11 years. Dark loam over red clay subsoil. He'd applied 18 tons of poultry litter to it in 1978, another 12 tons in 1982. He ran winter wheat on it from October through April, then a soybean crop from May through October. Average yield on that bottom ground, 48 bushels per acre for beans. County average was 31. He knew what it had taken to get there. He also knew what disrupted subsoil did to crop yields for years afterward. The 90 days passed faster than he expected. The crew arrived on a Monday in June of 1987. 4 pieces of heavy equipment, a Caterpillar D8 dozer, 2 track hoes, and a trencher with a 42-inch bucket. They staged at the county road and walked the corridor with stakes and orange marking paint. Eldon stood at the field edge watching. The crew foreman, a man named Strickland, walked over and introduced himself. Said the work would take 3 weeks. Said they'd do their best to preserve the topsoil. Said if Eldon had any concerns, there was a phone number on the bottom of his letter. Eldon said he'd be watching. Strickland nodded and went back to his crew. They started with the topsoil stripping. The D8 scraped it into windrows, 10 to 14 inches deep, running parallel to the proposed trench line. This was standard right-of-way practice. Strip the topsoil, keep it separate. Replace it after the pipe was in. The intention was sound. What happened to the windrows over the next 3 weeks was something else. It rained on the 5th day. Not heavy, about 1.3 inches, which in a dry June would have been welcome. But the stripped corridor had no vegetative cover. The topsoil windrows, loose and exposed, began to move. Not dramatically. Just slowly, the way soil does when you disturb it and let rain find it. By the time Eldon walked the field on the 6th morning, he could see where the edge windrows had slumped, where the rain had cut small channels through them, where the best 14 inches of 30 years of soil improvement had started mixing with the clay subsoil beneath. He stood there for a long time. The construction took 22 days, not 3 weeks. The crew tamped and backfilled the trench. The D8 pushed the topsoil windrows back over the disturbed corridor. Strickland drove the corridor one last time in a pickup, rolled down his window, told Eldon it looked good, and said Mid-South appreciated his cooperation. The crew was gone by Thursday afternoon. Eldon walked the corridor that evening. What he saw was not the field he'd handed over. The surface appeared flat, but under his boots the ground had a different feel. Compacted, dense, he pulled a soil probe from behind his truck seat. a 24-inch step probe he'd bought from a Farmco dealer in Benton, and drove it into the replanted corridor. It hit resistance at 7 inches. The same probe, in the undisturbed ground 10 feet away, went to 22 inches without effort. The topsoil had been replaced. The compaction hadn't been addressed. He planted soybeans on the corridor in the same week as the rest of the low field. Same seed lot, same planting population, same date. By August, the difference was visible from the county road. The undisturbed ground stood 38 inches tall, deep green, heavy with pods. The corridor stood 21 inches, yellowing in patches, then knotted. The compaction had stressed the root systems, cut off water movement, and driven the yield down before the plants had a chance. He harvested the field in October of 1987. Low field total, 44.2 bushels per acre on the undisturbed ground. Corridor average, 19.8 bushels per acre. He had the yield maps from his combine. He had the planting records. He had the soil probe numbers. He wrote it all down in a spiral notebook that evening and put it in the file cabinet in his office. Then, he wrote a letter to Mid-South Energy Transmission. He described the yield loss. He described the compaction measurements. He asked for compensation equal to the projected yield deficit over a 5-year restoration period, which he calculated at $4,380 based on current soybean prices and the 18-acre corridor footprint. He mailed it certified, return receipt requested, to the address on the original letter. 6 weeks later, he received a response. 1 page. Corporate letterhead. The response said that Mid-South had fulfilled all obligations under the 1961 easement agreement, that restoration to pre-construction condition had been completed, that no further compensation was owed, that if Mr. Marsh had additional concerns, he was welcome to contact their legal department. Eldon read the letter, folded it, put it in the file cabinet with the spiral notebook. Then he started looking for the 1961 easement. He didn't have a copy. The original easement had been granted by the previous owner, a man named Leon Pritchard, who'd sold the property to Eldon's father in 1969. Eldon's father had passed in 1981. There was no paperwork trail in the family files that went back to the Pritchard transaction. The abstract of title was in a cardboard box in a closet in Eldon's office, rubber-banded and sorted by decade. He spent 2 evenings working through it, found the 1969 warranty deed from Pritchard to his father, found the 1956 survey plat, didn't find the 1961 easement instrument. He drove to the Saline County Courthouse in Benton on a Thursday morning. The deed room was on the 2nd floor. A single clerk behind a wooden counter, the kind of county office that still ran on a card index and a Xerox machine. Eldon told her what he was looking for. A pipeline right-of-way easement granted somewhere around 1961 on property he now owned. Grantor would have been Leon Pritchard. Grantee would have been some earlier version of Mid-South Energy Transmission or its predecessor. The clerk pointed him to the grantor-grantee index books on the east wall. He found it in 47 minutes. Easement and right-of-way agreement. Recorded September 14, 1961. Book 412, page 118. Grantor, Leon B. Pritchard, Grantee, Southern States Pipeline Corporation. He took the book number to the clerk and asked for a copy. He read the document standing at the copy machine, 3 pages. Standard right-of-way language for the era. The grantee received the right to construct, operate, and maintain 1 pipeline across a described corridor. Standard conditions about access and maintenance followed. Then he got to Section 7. Section 7 was titled Restoration and Damages. The language in Section 7 was not standard. It had been hand-inserted. typed onto a separate page and physically stapled into the original instrument before recording, then photocopied with it. Someone had negotiated those terms at the time of signing. The language was specific in a way that boilerplate language never was. Section 7 read, in part, upon completion of pipeline construction, grantee shall restore all disturbed cropland to a condition equal in productivity to pre-construction levels, as measured by documented yield history, for a period of not less than 3 years preceding construction. In the event that crop yields on disturbed areas fail to equal or exceed pre-construction averages within 5 years of construction completion, grantee shall compensate grantor, or grantor's successors in title, for yield deficits calculated at market price for the applicable crop year, for each crop year in which deficit productivity continues, for a period not to exceed 10 years from construction completion. He read it again and again, equal in productivity to pre-construction levels. Successors in title, 10 years. He drove home and called an attorney in Little Rock, a man named Garfield who'd handled a fence line dispute for Eldon's neighbor 3 years prior. He read the language to Garfield over the phone. Garfield asked him to read it again. Garfield was quiet for a moment. Then he said to make copies and bring them in. The meeting with Garfield lasted 2 hours. Garfield laid out the position carefully. The 1961 easement ran with the land. It was a covenant binding on successors, which meant it bound Mid-South Energy Transmission as surely as it had bound Southern States Pipeline Corporation. Mid-South had acquired Southern States in 1974, along with all its agreements, obligations, and encumbrances. The restoration language in Section 7 was not ambiguous. Garfield said that whoever had drafted it on Pritchard's behalf in 1961 had been careful. More careful than most. The language explicitly named successors in title on the grantor's side, which meant Eldon had standing. The 10-year yield compensation window had been triggered the moment construction ended in June 1987. Garfield wrote a demand letter, not a request, a demand. 12 pages, single-spaced, with the easement instrument attached as Exhibit A, Eldon's yield records attached as Exhibit B, and Garfield's calculation of owed compensation through the 10-year window attached as Exhibit C. The total figure, projected at 1987 soybean prices and compounded forward at market rate assumptions, was $41,200. Eldon didn't know what to expect. He had dealt with corporations before, had bought equipment from dealers who didn't honor their paperwork, had filed an insurance claim once that took 2 years to settle. He expected resistance. Mid-South responded in 31 days. Not with a denial, with a counteroffer. Their attorneys acknowledged the Section 7 language, acknowledged the succession of obligation, offered $18,500 as a full settlement and release. Garfield called Eldon, said it was a real number, said Mid-South knew their position was weak, said the question was whether Eldon wanted certainty or whether he wanted to fight for the full amount. Garfield's honest assessment was that a jury in Saline County would look at a farmer's yield records and a corporate easement document and fine for the farmer. But litigation took time. $18,000 was real money. Eldon asked what Garfield recommended. Garfield said that depended on what Eldon wanted, the money or the principal. Eldon said both. They countered at $34,500 and a binding restoration plan. Not just money. A written agreement requiring Mid-South to retain a licensed agronomist to prescribe and fund a soil compaction remediation program on the corridor, to be implemented within 1 growing season, and to be verified by a third-party soil test every April for 4 consecutive years. If productivity benchmarks were not met, the yield compensation clock continued, regardless of the settlement payment. Mid-South accepted. The agronomist they hired was a man from the University of Arkansas Extension Service. He walked the corridor in early March of 1988. Prescribed deep tillage to 18 inches using a subsoil ripper, followed by a broadcast application of 400 pounds per acre of gypsum. Then a cover crop of tillage radish to fracture the compaction pan biologically. Cost to Mid-South for the remediation prescription and implementation, $6,800. The subsoil ripper ran the corridor in April. The gypsum went on in May. The tillage radish was drilled in August after the soybean harvest. Eldon stood at the field edge watching the radish emerge in late September. By October, the 14-inch radish taproots had broken through the compaction layer the track hose had created 14 months earlier. The first soil test came back in April of 1989. Bulk density on the corridor, 1. 31 grams per cubic centimeter. Bulk density on undisturbed ground adjacent, 1.28 grams per cubic centimeter. Not identical, close enough that roots could move. The 1989 soybean crop told the rest. Corridor average, 41.3 bushels per acre. Undisturbed average, 46.8 bushels. Still a gap. But the trajectory had reversed. Eldon added the numbers to his spiral notebook, added the soil test to his file cabinet. Sent a copy to Garfield. The 1990 crop came in at 44.7 on the corridor and 47.1 on undisturbed ground. Closing, by 1991, the gap was 1.4 bushels per acre, within the margin of normal field variability. The agronomist from the Extension Service signed off on the benchmark. The annual soil testing requirement expired. The settlement terms had been met. Eldon harvested 47.2 bushels per acre from the corridor that fall. Highest number the low field had ever recorded on any portion. The gypsum and radish tillage had done something the original soil management hadn't. Broken up a layer of subsoil hardpan that had existed before the pipeline ever came through. The compaction the construction created had forced the fix that improved the ground beyond its original condition. He didn't say that to anyone for a while. Garfield's office sent a closing letter in December of 1991. Settlement fully satisfied. Obligations discharged. Garfield noted in his letter that the Section 7 language in the 1961 easement was among the most protective agricultural restoration clauses he had encountered in 20 years of rural property law. He asked if Eldon knew who had drafted it. Eldon didn't. He drove out to see a man named Clifton Pritchard in late January of 1992. Leon Pritchard's son, 78 years old, living in a brick house in Benton, retired from the telephone company. Eldon sat in his kitchen and asked about the 1961 pipeline easement. About Section 7. About whoever had written that language. Clifton poured coffee and thought about it for a moment. Said his father had been wary of pipeline companies. Said Leon had watched a neighbor's field get torn up by a gas line in the 1950s and had decided he wasn't going to let that happen without teeth in the paper. Said Leon had driven to a law office in Hot Springs and told the lawyer exactly what he wanted. Said the lawyer had told him the language was unusually specific and might be hard to get the company to accept. Leon had told the lawyer to put it in anyway and let them say no. They hadn't said no. They'd signed it in September of 1961 and probably never thought about it again. Eldon drove home from Benton on a cold afternoon in January. The low field was dormant, the winter wheat a thin green over brown ground. The corridor was indistinguishable now from the rest of the field. Same color, same stand density, same small ridges left by the drill. The settlement check from Mid-South had paid off the note on Eldon's grain bin. The remediation had improved his ground. The document that made it happen had been sitting in the Saline County deed room since 1961. signed by a man who'd been dead for 20 years. Written by a lawyer whose name Eldon never learned. He farmed the low field for another 14 years after that. Retired in 2005. Sold the property to his youngest daughter and her husband, who converted the row crop operation to a grass-fed beef enterprise. They still run the low field, still run winter wheat on it in rotation. The corridor is productive ground. You can't tell where the pipeline runs from looking at it. Eldon's spiral notebook went into a filing box with the other property records when he transferred the deed. His daughter found it last spring while organizing the office. The soil probe numbers from 1987 written in pencil. The yield map averages in 2 columns, corridor and undisturbed. The Section 7 language copied out in Eldon's handwriting, with 2 words underlined, successors in title. She called him. He told her to keep it with the abstract. Said the pipeline was still there, said the easement still ran with the land. Said if Mid-South or anyone else ever came back, she should read Section 7 first. She keeps the notebook in the deed box, right behind the original abstract. Still there. Still readable. Still working.